But Lachman argues, yeah, it's Encyclopedia Ouspensky, the genius in the shadow of Gurdjieff. Now, Lachman himself, he runs the Daily Grail website, which you probably know is a compilation of all that's weird and wonderful, and he does this on a daily basis, and he also includes from time to time various articles and reviews. It's uncommonly intelligent for the field, I find. But his key argument is that Ouspensky had two parts to his person. There was a part which was poetic and romantic, and there was other that was cold and analytic, to be simple as you like. And that Gurdjieff essentially manipulated him into manipulating himself. That Ouspensky, in a sense, he essentially shut down that romantic and imaginative and creative part of himself in order to realize this higher consciousness that Gurdjieff held out in front of him, some sort of realizable goal. Now, as I said to you the last time we spoke, Ouspensky failed in this, and this failure prompted him to reject the idea of the possibility that such a goal could be reached, and consequently would, famously said, there is no system. But there was what I wanted to relate, in particular, was Lachman's idea that what had happened when that Gurdjieff was already familiar with Ouspensky's books. And Lachman argues that essentially In Search of the Miraculous is a reworked version of Tertium Organum, which was Ouspensky's magnum opus, written before he came into contact with Gurdjieff. And Lachman, of course, points to some circumstantial evidence that suggests this is possible. He points to the parallels in the ideas, and of course, the fact that Gurdjieff himself had admitted to reading and studying Ouspensky's books before he had met Ouspensky. So that's just a roundabout way of saying is that there may be an elegant parallel to Strieber's reworking and refashioning of ideas he had picked up elsewhere and passing it off as his own work. There might be, that parallel may exist with his, in the influence which was most decisive in his life.
Well, I have heard at least one interview with Lachman about the book, and I think I downloaded a copy and started reading. I got a few chapters in but didn't finish for whatever reason. If he makes so strong a claim as to say that, if I understand you right, that In Search of the Miraculous is a reworking of Ouspensky's earlier book, or that Gurdjieff in his doctrine was reworking Ouspensky's material, I think it would be probably too strong a claim, just from what I remember reading in Search of the Miraculous. I think there was definitely overlap. I mean, I can see Gurdjieff in his effort to be the master, which always involves a bit of charlatanry,
Yeah.
Not only acquainting himself with Ouspensky's material, but trying to glean what he saw as most important from it, so that then he could redeploy it as the originator, of those ideas, now that they've been improved just by having gone through the filter of Gurdjieff himself. And I can also see Ouspensky in writing Miraculous to be still concerned with the basic themes that animated his thought in his previous book. But it's probably too strong a claim to go further than that. And as far as Strieber goes, at least, and this is all just my opinion, certainly about the first point, but as far as Strieber goes, the whole preoccupation with the higher dimensional, which is a type of metaphor that you hear thrown around in New Age circles all the time, but Strieber's very particular preoccupation with it, the idea that you can view human life, quote, outside of time, the idea that eternity, has a shape, is described in terms of its shape or its visual characteristics and so on. I think Strieber lifts that directly from Ouspensky. Whether or not that a similar set of concerns re-arises in Gurdjieff. I mean, it's possible, especially if Gurdjieff had been reading Ouspensky, but I think really it's Ouspensky. And just like I tried to point out in that Strieber paper, this whole idea of the fourth dimensional was sort of a big new thing at the end of the 19th century. You had the famous book Flatland, which was sort of like almost like a children's book in a way, but it tried to fictionalize the life of creatures living at different dimensional levels and so on. And Strieber has himself used the term flatland in his, I can't give you the specifics now, but the suggestion is there that he's familiar with that part of it. Ouspensky, of course, referred to it. And there are whole chapters in the book you mentioned, the title now, with Tertium, Organum. Yeah. If I remember correctly, there's a whole chapter in there. Geez, I really have to go back and look at the details now. But something like a new model of the universe, which was itself originally a book.
Yeah.
So either he just uses that short pamphlet as a chapter in the so-called magnum opus, or he rewrites the same material. But Ouspensky, mathematically trained, that was his thing, trying to visualize how things looked at the level of the fourth dimension, and specifically, and this is key because it doesn't show up very often elsewhere, specifically trying to visualize and conceptualize time as a form of space. This is something I was at pains to try to point out in that stupid Strieber paper. Even today, when you hear physicists talk about time, or you look at popular science articles or videos or whatever, they're happy to talk about higher dimensions. But it's always some n number of dimensions of space plus one of time. So they might talk of a 10-dimensional space, which is a sort of algebraic construction. For these mathematicians, the number of dimensions is simply the number of coordinates that you put. It's the number that you have in a coordinate system. So for example, a three-dimensional space, this is very, very simplistically put, three-dimensional space for them is only a space in which points are defined as x, comma, y, comma, z. So it's therefore three-dimensional because it's got three coordinates. A nine-dimensional space means a point will be defined by having 9 coordinates. So for them, they'll define it in these homogeneous terms and then just slap on one of time, which is sort of baldly thought of as a dimension of change. For Ouspensky, this was not the case. For Ouspensky, time itself, what we perceive to be time, is from a higher dimensional perspective just a form of space. So change is something that, I mean, it's all in strict analogy. There's nothing qualitatively different about time. It's just another form of space that we cannot get outside of and perceive as such because we're embedded in it at a particular level. So that's where I've always thought Strieber specifically, I mean, he appropriates that wholesale. One example mentioned in the paper, I think, comes at the end of The Secret School, or if not that, one of the just prior books, Breakthrough or Transformation, where he basically specifically says that he, Strieber, in a vision is able to see all of human eternity. It's kind of like a big elongated shape with like a glowing at one end and a different visual characteristic at another.
Like
and in the key, it's all, well, the tapestry of memories, exactly what he says again and again, where viewed from outside of time, all of human life, every moment, every experience is basically a frozen object that can be perceived as a spatial one if you are outside of time. So it goes on and on. But in the key, it's a major theme and concept, and in previous books it is. And without being able to master the entire Gurdjieff literature to say where Strieber gets all of his Gurdjieff-related ideas, it did seem fair to say that when it comes to that higher dimensional concept, he definitely lifts all of that from Ouspensky without any attribution, of course, whatsoever. Strieber, as if Strieber is now the originator of these ideas and these insights.
Yeah, or possibly it could have come via Maurice Nicoll. He wrote a book, I think, called Living Time, where, obviously by the title, that the relationship of that consideration of time to spirit and consciousness is the dominant idea. Nicoll himself was a very close student of Ouspensky. In fact, I don't think he even met Gurdjieff. He stayed with Ouspensky for 20 odd years. Living time and the integration of the life. So, perhaps Strieber got it from that, but Strieber has, without attribution, I feel, in his discussing of various Bible stories and books of the Bible, leans very heavily on Nicoll's ideas as presented in The Mark and the New Man. Even sort of a cursory examination of either of those books would certainly convince you that there is the inspiration for Strieber's discussions.
Well, that wouldn't surprise me at all. As far as the geometrical, sort of mathematical concept of time as a form of space and the fourth dimension and all that, even if Nicoll was familiar with Ouspensky and his own vision was informed by it, I don't think there's any doubt that really this very idiosyncratic way of looking at things originated with Ouspensky.
Right.
Sometime, if you get the chance, if you can track down the earlier material written by Ouspensky, you'll see it in.
Well,
I mean, it's undeniable. It's not just thematic. It's not just purely verbal sort of speculation. I mean, he tries to explain it in mathematical terms. He spends countless pages on it. And incidentally, there's really no question that Strieber read Ouspensky. Obviously, if he's going to be involved in the Gurdjieff work, and if he's intellectually ambitious, as Strieber has always appeared to be, he's going to go for the major thinkers and definitely read them. But also, as pointed out in the paper, when Strieber in Communion claims that the tarot is a philosophical machine, again using this phrase without any attribution, he gets that from Ouspensky, who's quoting somebody else. And Ouspensky was the one who was interested in the tarot. Ouspensky was the one who specifically said the Tarot of Marseilles was the go-to deck and had the special qualities. Again, all this shit Strieber just reappropriates and presents as his own. So I don't think there's any question that he was a close reader of Ouspensky, at least early on.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I have a copy of Tertium Organum. It's in my hands at the moment. I've had it on my shelf for a long time, and I never read it. I was just under the loose impression that it was, I'm not sure how I describe it, but just a work of, sort of a hack work of popular science, albeit one that dates from the whatever it is. Let me see, date of publication, 1923. Yeah, 1923, English translation. But having, as I said, just cast my eyes over Lachman's book again, and just those concluding chapters, he does declare it quite a significant work. Regardless of its ambition to popularize certain ideas, that it is in itself a minorly significant work of some quality.
Well, I've just cracked open here what appears to be an online PDF version of A New Model of the Universe by Ouspensky. And of course, in Chapter 5, we have the symbolism of the tarot, which, as I recall, as I just mentioned, is where he goes into the Tarot of Marseilles, and he quotes Raymond Lully, who called famously called the Tarot a philosophical machine, which of course Strieber appropriates and passes off as his own comment. But then within the same book, for some reason, there's a chapter 10, A New Model of the Universe, again, where he tries to base this on physics. So it's a sort of mathematical intuitionist point of view, and it's very particular. It's not just sort of loose floating metaphor. This idea of time being itself just a kind of movement, a physical movement in space, in the same way that we might observe on a lower dimensional level space to have certain characteristics. According to him, every dimension is basically relatable by analogy. But in any event, anyone would be hard-pressed to deny that this very particular mode of thinking comes from Ouspensky, who was a fairly unique thinker, whatever the successes of, what he came up with. And then when, of course, it comes to Strieber, it's all just taken wholesale. And, Strieber, in one respect, it's not a surprise. You see this with every autodidact, anybody who is self-taught, that they are so busy generating ideas and generating their own particular vision, which is perfectly fine, that they just become a vast churning engine, and other people's ideas get caught up in them all the time and they get spit back out. So, in a scholar, typically the practice is the opposite. The practice is not to have originality and to very fastidiously quote every single source of every idea that you're presenting, because the idea is basically that scholarship, to quote the scholars of the past. Whereas, someone who sets out to be an original thinker will do in a way the opposite. In their pursuit of originality, they're happy to steal ideas or whole perspectives. Then they end up presenting them as if they are their own, without attribution. And then, to bring it back to what you said earlier, yeah, there is certainly a parallel, because somebody who seeks to be a spiritual master, or somebody who speaks to have a group following him, is not going to go out of his way to mention some other authority where he got the ideas. Yeah. So Strieber, with his group of over 50s, over 60s, graying, new age, sometimes contactees, on his website, paying subscribers, who chime in with the comments, and, "Oh, Whitley, you're so wonderful," and "Anne was so wise," and who just go on at length, every comment the same as the last. He's never going to sit there and write out for them, "Well, I got this idea from so-and-so," because then, of course, they might be tempted to look up so-and-so and then become a follower of so-and-so.
Yeah.
So.
Well, we talk, let me just check the journal entry. Let's see any response. No, of course not.
There won't be any response to that.
There's not even... I was kind of surprised. Well, not to go back into it, but there's not even... Nobody here actually goes, yeah, that's not actually a bad question. So this is a breathtakingly sophisticated communication system. Why is it so delivered such garbled messages? But anyway, that's by the by.
Or even just vague messages. No messages at all. I can't think of him at any time when I was following his material there ever giving a specific detailed example of something that supposedly came through that implant.
Have joy.
But I don't think that was the implant. I think that was a gray whispering into his ear one night.
Oh, okay, yeah, specifically came through the implant. No, I can't think of anything either.
He said that they'd been able to glimpse other worlds with it. But that's it. I can't think of any specific message he's ever said. But I did come across something last night which really gave me a laugh and sort of got me going. So now, since we're, frequently talking about these vast claims made by Strieber that become even vaster, over on this website, Goodreads.com, where people post their book reviews, it turns out Strieber has his own little author page. And he's got a new thing up on the afterlife revolution. And I just want to point out a couple of things in it that really ought to sort of turn your stomach.
Is this, let me just join in here. Is this on the Amazon page, you say?
No, Goodreads.com.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah, I know that.
Yeah. If you do a search for Goodreads, Strieber, Afterlife Revolution, he's got a little page up. This piece of shit. So here's how it begins. First, thanks for all the great reviews, and I assume that some of you are also among the Amazon reviewers, so 1,000 thanks. Yeah. Second paragraph. Now, if you've read The Afterlife Revolution, you'll know that my wife Anne died in August of 2015, and then executed a plan of contact that we had worked out back in the 1990s when we realized that there really was an afterlife.
Fucking asshole.
What? Since when? When did that happen? When was there this plan that they concocted?
He's getting the fucking hang of it here. He really is getting a feel for this. There is no way to prove or disprove this comment. So...
Yeah, there's no way to... Of course, there's no way to prove it or disprove it in the strictest sense. However, you can assess the likelihood of it if you have followed his work for all of that period and you are familiar with it in detail, because this kind of shit would be something that he wouldn't fail to write about. In general, with this kind of assertion that comes up out of the blue years later, there are some that he makes that he's been making for years all along since the beginning, and then there are some of these like blue assertions that come up and you're like, what the fuck? There's no way. And since they decided, or when they realized there really was an afterlife in the 1990s, bullshit.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't point to a specific example at this moment, but I'd be willing to bet money, nevertheless, that if you open up Communion or Transformation, both written in the late 80s, you'll probably have Strieber in there opining about the afterlife. I don't think there's any question that he's ever believed in as a devout Catholic. Fuck off. So then the next paragraph, there are a lot of reasons we came to understand this. Oh yeah, which are detailed in the book. What I want to talk about here is things that have happened after it was published, and there are a lot of them. Anne is still around and she's good at this. Next paragraph, she has changed the way I feel about life and afterlife and the way I handle grief. Has she? There's just such a bubbling, delightful sense of presence when she's involved with me. It's the same old thing. Remember, bubbling? That term, bubbling, was used for the master of the key. The bubbling sense of joy. His joyousness, how he was on the verge of bubbling laughter when he was talking to poor Whitley, who, was just so foolish in his misunderstandings. So the same type of fantasy concoction. Here's the next thing, though, that galls me. From February 18th to the 23rd, I was at a conference at Esalen, or Esalen, the New Age Institute there. I was there with my friend and fellow UnknownCountry.com podcaster, Jeremy Vaeni, the medium Paul Selig, and a woman who was transformed into a psychic by a lightning strike, Elizabeth Cohn. So Jeremy Vaeni now is getting a little bit better mention in Strieber's material. You skip down a few paragraphs. As those of you who have read Afterlife know, Anne indicates her presence by the appearance of a white moth, generally in situations where no moths are around. After my presentation on the Afterlife Revolution, most of the conferees went to dinner at the Iselin dining hall. As they were eating, a white moth appeared and flew up and down the table, then flew up in the air and just seemed to disappear. Then, at the final banquet in a private dining room, now again we're somewhere else now, separated in space and time, a white moth flew around and landed on Jeremy Vaney's head! Exclamation point. And then in parentheses, Anne loved his approach to the unknown and his show. So that, to me, Strieber very rarely would single out somebody like that, you know, for this kind of recognition. So it seems to me that Vaney, through his efforts at sucking dick, basically, kissing Strieber's ass on his website, defending him and so on, Vaney, his stock has gone up. So now he gets a special mention in this, of course, this almost religious scenario where he's touched on the head by the moth. It's almost like a baptism, you know. The moth comes down, it's Anne's spirit, or it's animated by Anne, and touches Jeremy Vaney on the head almost as a sign of approval, a sign of recognition, you know.
The way I'd read that is, I mean, it's that Unknown Country is not making a lot of money. It doesn't seem to be a thriving commercial concern. And I would say it is, whatever you may say about Vaney, he seems a bit more dynamic than Strieber himself. You know, he does manage to bang out a show once a week. He tries to do, he produces it obviously with what enthusiasm he has in a certain degree of energy. Whether the final product is appealing or not, I mean, it just looks like that might be an element of his platform that Strieber wishes to keep secure. Because, I mean, there's been a number of people who have been involved who've walked away. Linda Moulton Howe, she did, you know, weekly reports, and you had John Hogue was sort of made regular appearances. William Henry, he doesn't do any more shows, does he? He's gone his way. I think he's gone a guy. So it could be just
he was replaced by Vaney. So
yeah, okay. What happened to him?
No, I agree with you. I mean, he's trying to secure. Well, it's hard to say. Maybe the ratings went down, and Strieber decided to replace him, or who knows. But no, I agree with you. I mean, Strieber giving his quasi-religious seal of approval, almost like Vaney as a successor, you know, is definitely to keep that side of the monthly income coming in with the view count and so on. But you see how these people they just fucking use each other.
Yeah.
Vaney, who is a meathead, who is not an original thinker, nevertheless wants to be seen as a serious commentator on the subject, which is why he has always done over the years is seek out these feuds. And he's like the policeman. He's even used that grotesque phrase in the past, where the the world of the paranormal field, UFOlogy, they need more self-policing, because that will improve any situation. The addition of police, but that's fine. So yeah, he has from the beginning. His whole shtick has been to try to be Mr. Jolly, Mr. Affable, but by exterior, but then underneath that to really be a zealot. And the form that his zealotry takes is to get involved in these feuds, first with a group of podcasters on this show called the Paracast, where they pissed all over each other for months and years and had their followers doing it. And then Vaney, of course, growing in his confidence, decided to seek out feuds with people like David Jacobs and Bud Hopkins. And all the while he tries to present himself like he's just some objective, neutral arbiter, but really it's him and his pissing contest. So Vaney wants to be an authority. He wants to be an opinion maker. In fact, I remember hearing on his shows, one of these throwaway remarks where, like, the lady doth protest too much. Vaney said something like, yes, and, even we in our own little way, are shaping public opinion. You're not shaping any fucking public opinion. Who are you kidding? Your 100 podcast listeners, give me a fucking break. But clearly the aspiration to shape public opinion is there. So for him to get in under the arm, to be tucked in, nestled in the armpit of Whitley Strieber on Unknown Country must have been like a dream come true. And likewise, Strieber needs him because Vaney is at least capable enough in his pissing contest modes that he can keep the troops in line in the comments sections.
Yeah.
When the whole thing with the Strieber paper came out, it was Vaney, the lieutenant, leading the charge. Oh, I don't even think I should open this paper because I bet it has a virus. Or who is this person anyway to question the best-selling New York Times author, blah, blah, blah. So Vaney is the faithful lieutenant. Strieber needs the content. And I'm sure they both rely on each other in that way. And so now Vaney gets a moth landing on his head as a metaphysical approval of his efforts.
I know, yeah. And it's, as we talk, one thing that sort of jumps out at me is the absence of Strieber's son in any of this. He's even Billy Myers, one of his sons, came forward and backed his father in. He said, look, I was there. It was true. These things happened. Whereas Andrew Strieber, no, never makes an appearance. I mean, there could be other reasons for that, but if you could see, if your father's desperate and he's hitting you up for money, he's been rejected by the world, how come he just doesn't go forward and say, well, hang on, he's worth listening to?
Yeah. Well, he's probably got the good sense to have separated himself from the whole thing for many years and to have a separate set of interests. I would suspect, if it ever came down to it, that Strieber could press his son into a statement of, support of some kind. But I think the form that type of statement would take would be the same form that you see in the Amazon reviews of this afterlife atrocity by Strieber's associates. So after I posted my negative review, then of course, the wheels came off and Strieber bitched and lamented, and then all sorts of people had to pile in. So he had this Raven Dana person who had experiences at the cabin that were detailing communion. She got on there, and Whitley's not a fraud. I had real experiences. And others who basically say the same thing. Marla Fries got on there the other day. So Marla Fries, of course, has been in the wilderness for some time, and I happened to notice on the page that she hosted a Dreamland show the other day, or a subscriber special or something like that. So now, of course, then like a week afterward, she gets on the Afterlife Revolution page and gives her positive review. So, back scratching. But the point is that even the statements of support from people, whether it's a Kripal or whether it's Ed Conroy who got on there, who was Strieber's pal, or Raven Dana, all they can say is that Strieber is sincere. He's in earnest. He's not lying in the obvious sense of the term. But they can go no further than that. None of them can answer, and this includes Strieber himself. It just goes to show you that it's undeniable. None of them can answer the specific cases where it's clear that Whitley's imagination's got the better of him and he's just making it all up out of whole cloth, but while convincing himself at the same time that it's all true. Nobody can touch any of those examples in their specificity. All they can fall back on is, well, I've known Strieber for a long time, and he's a friend of mine. He's an upright guy. He's not just making it all up for money, in the sense of an ordinary hoaxer. But nobody can go any further than that.
Yeah. That's a sort of, you've been down by faint praise in that instance.
Yeah, and it also goes to show you how small the stakes are, because none of these defenses, either the very specious ones that Strieber himself has made on his website, neither Strieber's defenses of himself nor any of these even weaker ones in the form of positive reviews or jerk-offs like Vaney, none of them would pass anything close to a smell test outside of the unknown country's site. Nobody who is not already a Strieber, an avid Strieber follower, would fall for any of these defenses. And I'm not talking about wild-eyed skeptics who want to damn everybody and declare them heretics against the scientific faith. And no, I'm just talking about middle-of-the-road reasonable people who can just look at one of these defenses and see how strange and distorted it is, how it doesn't actually answer any of the essential charges put forth. And so I mean, it's a complete failure. But the point is that it functions only, again, to keep the troops in line. These 50 or 100 or however many they are, gray-haired subscribers who burned out on drugs in the 70s, or who had their contact experience and they're all fucking nuts now, or whatever it is, who just, the Whitley Strieber fan club, the core supporters, they're the only ones who appear to be convinced by any of that bullshit. And they're convinced by anything. Anything Strieber says is gospel. Anne was a wise woman. Oh, okay, yes. And their love story is eternal. Oh, of course. So their love story is eternal. So all the pablum and personal mythology that Strieber spits out, they just suck it up and regurgitate it. And the better they regurgitate it, the more Strieber's likely to get on and compliment them. I saw a thread the other day when I was on that blog post that Strieber made, reading the comments, and you get some people on there who very articulately regurgitate the bullshit that Strieber has created about him, his wife, their relationship, Anne's newfound spiritual wisdom. It's like the commenters all sort of compete with each other to try to repeat what Strieber has said in the most convincing, articulate way for themselves. So they get that little pat on the head. What a sick fucking operation. But again, luckily it doesn't appear to have any kind of traction outside of the website itself. Other than the people who go to it, it's, thank God, maybe it's a dying enterprise.
Well, it would seem to be. I mean, it's now gone, but the old forum had died on its face, died on its asshole years ago. It would go months without posting. And I remember there being a time when it would have, a couple of dozen new posts a day.
Yeah.
And it just, I don't know whether, that sort of discussion migrated elsewhere, but it was no longer found.
Well, they chose poorly. They chose some sort of very small-time proprietary software for the forum. And then supposedly the company went out of business. And then they needed an upgrade to the forum in order for it to continue to function right with their servers or some bullshit like that. They couldn't get the upgrade. So the thing just sat there. And Strieber, of course, realized that the opinions of the people on his site were worthless, and that all he really wanted to do as far as communicating with people goes was to promote on Facebook and Twitter. So all of the quote-unquote discussion died in the forum, moved to Strieber's Facebook page, where he just, basically, as I understand it, Strieber will announce the latest Dreamland show on Twitter or whatever, and that gets reposted to Facebook. And then there are all sorts of comments, and that constitutes the discussion. And that's in addition to the weak comments that you see under the pieces on Unknown Country, the direct ones made by subscribers. Fuck the whole business. What a sick sack of shit. Just, ugh.
Well, there's a lot of it. Unfortunately, there's a lot of it. I mean, that sort of gut reaction you just had there, said, what a sick operation. And I've been thinking that recently, just about the institutional Gurdjieff work, reading around a number of accounts. It's just fucking appalling what's happening. It mirrors my own experience, which was, relatively a small part of my life, but nonetheless, injurious, I suppose, especially to maybe my own self-regard, but just the idea that there are fucking people who will pretend. You'll have a group leader who just won't be honest about what he actually knows and doesn't know, but will allow somebody to sort of project their hope for a definitive authority in certain areas, will allow that projection to sit on them, and then they will act under that impression, to further that hope.
Well, that's what makes it so difficult to untangle. I mean, the levels of self-deception and the webs of mutual deception.
Well, that's it.
I mean, this is what. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's only at the end. My own experience. I'm dealing with someone who's got an appallingly and obviously poor self-awareness. He's got a very poor working memory, and emotionally, he's a fucking asshole. It's the truth of the matter. And I say the last point is someone I think my insight is worthwhile here. It's not as if I work in a cubicle by myself with a poor sense of human interaction. I deal with dozens, hundreds of people every day, so I'm alive to what human behavior can be. And so I end up just experiencing this sort of behavior, this disposition, which is far from generally a socially acceptable standard. And there's someone who's obviously just has basic problems with the functioning of their own mind. And here's someone I allowed guide me in their way for a number of years. And the sad thing is, when I look at that experience, is I always had intimations this was the case from the very beginning. I've already mentioned this point, but I joined that group, left the group, and rejoined. In both instances on rejoining, I was told, there's certain documentation, papers, tasks I'll send you. And the guy forgot to do it both times. And it's, these are the bare facts I can see after the event. And I'm left with this situation where, I'm projecting something onto a situation. That person is allowing that. I'm deceiving myself. I'm allowing him to deceive me. He then deceives himself. And it's pathetic. It's pathetic. And
well, that's the thing.
Jesus.
Well, I mean, that's the gut reaction. I mean, for me, it's a matter of, okay, your default position is that basically everything's bullshit. Everybody's full of shit. We know that. You can see it everywhere. At every level of every human institution, you've got people who are behaving badly, who are not self-aware, who are, you just name it, the huge laundry list. Everything's dysfunctional. So you're not surprised when something's dysfunctional. But you are surprised in the end, after like 10 or 12 or 15 steps into it, when by agreement with somebody or with some group, you say, geez, isn't everything dysfunctional? And they say, yeah, everything is dysfunctional. And you say, yeah, and doesn't everything just suck badly because people are so self-deceptive? And yeah, that's true. And geez, people just use each other for their own ends. And it goes, yeah. So you think that you are standing there at the overlook with somebody who's seeing the exact same thing you are, and they're saying to you the same thing that you're saying, and you think it's like, yeah, we see it from the same perspective. And at the end of it, they've just been fooling you the whole time, or they've been fooling themselves in order to fool you, or they aren't even aware that they're fooling themselves. And it's again, the bottom line though is bullshit. But it's a convoluted, even worse form of bullshit. The saying, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me.
Yeah.
When you're talking about these convoluted, totally dysfunctional clusterfuck situations of confusion and deception, it's like, fool me 13 times.
Yeah.
Shame on me.
Yeah.
And it's that way. It's that way with for me. It's that way with the Strieber site and with Strieber's work and all of that. Because okay, so you start off and you can take just a passing glance at everything in the UFO world, all of the sites, all of the people, and you can basically just see that they're crazy or they're stupid or they're lying. Okay, so it's all garbage basically. And then Strieber comes along, and Strieber is able to write a book like Communion, which is so vividly well written that obviously, from an artistic, literary point of view, there's real talent there. It's undeniable. When somebody has real talent, there's something undeniable and undeniably different about the person. And with all of the intellectual references and so on, so you think, here's somebody with a credible intellect. He's artistically gifted. He's got a credible intellect. So here's somebody worth following, not in the religious sense, but whose work is worth following. And then when you look at his attitudes toward the subject, you see him say things like, well, we need to keep the question open. We shouldn't tell ourselves it's alien just because, it corresponds to our particular like sci-fi fantasy, blah, blah, blah. So you have somebody who either explicitly or implicitly is against self-deception and illusions and fantasies when it comes to the topic of contact and all of these different things. And so you're being told exactly what ought to mean that there's no bullshit present. Like you take a Geiger counter out and you turn it on and there's zero radiation. This reading is telling you there's no radiation. And say you've got 10 other tests to measure for radiation, because you want to know desperately whether there's radiation there. And in this case, radiation is a metaphor for bullshit. And you take all these different readings and all the readings are telling you no bullshit. Maybe accidental mistakes or maybe, things that can be forgiven, but no bullshit. Okay, but then you find out in the end that it's even worse than you could have possibly imagined, that the bullshit is so convoluted, the self-deception is so epic, and there's no untangling it. There's no moment of truth where you can say, hey, Whitley, hold on a second. I've got it right here in your book. You're wrong about this. Now, none of that applies. It's been bullshit from the start. Yeah. Just a much more elaborate construction of bullshit. And that's the gut feeling. That's the, you fooled me 13 times. Shame on me.
I know. There was a small part of me, honestly, wish when I got the boot that the point of it all, or that there would be proof there was in fact just me. The problem was me. And I've kept in touch with people inside the group who still have time for me, and catch up with them from time to time. They're not meant to talk about the group, but they tell me anything I want to hear, And what's been apparent is that the problems I identified are not only still present, they seem to be getting worse. So just to give you a sense of the fucking craziness of it all, there's this friend of mine, Mike, he's quite articulate, voluble, likes to talk. He's always has ideas and always likes to discuss them. So he tells me, and he tells me that he's laughing. He's in an exasperated way. He said, one week, of course, certain people don't show up. They get a reading. It's part one of a reading from an island, I believe. And it's obviously incomplete. And it's incomplete to the point the themes there are incomplete to the point that they're almost unintelligible. That the second part is required to make sense of this reading. Following week comes around, and the plan had been is that the second part would be shared, would be sent around after that first meeting. The next meeting comes around. Mike didn't receive the reading, and what he you find out from other people is that they had received the reading. So at the meeting, he's informed. He's informed that only those who made a positive contribution in the first meeting got the second part. I think he's like, what the fuck? But this sort of bullshit. And you know, when you're talking about unknown countries, I hear a lot of what is forgivable. But what like burns me, gets me in my gut was my original complaint, at the heart of my original complaint that got the ball rolling, is that this group couldn't even operate on the level of ordinary life. Just a bunch of fuck-ups. It's not so much it's falling short of some grand ideal, but you know, it's passable as you know, a quasi-professional organization. It's just beneath that. You know, plans are made, nothing happens. Papers meant to be sent around, nothing happens. Tasks are meant to be written up, doesn't happen. Plans are made, no follow through. You know, just bullshit. You know, it's just ridiculous on that level. But like you know, I passed over it how many dozens and dozens of times, and you just go, oh well. So it's you know, it's a discomforting analysis, and I'm not actually sure what to make of it. It's just like anything else, like a lot of relationships we enter into them with certain hopes, and they tend to be desperate hopes because you hold on to them well past a point where your intelligence is trying to tell you that maybe this is not going to be an effective vehicle for those hopes and dreams.
Well, there's a clear difference between entering a group with an eye toward spiritual practice and so on, and visiting a website. So there I fully agree with you. I wouldn't say that what happens on Strieber's website is forgivable, but certainly you're less directly or personally affected by it. If you have a group which is devoted to lofty spiritual or personal goals that cannot even function at the level of basic organization,
Yeah.
you know, it might as well be like a book club that you go to once every couple of weeks. Nobody shows up, and you know, so much for those ideals. But when it comes to Strieber and his website, you could flip it around, because on the one hand, a private group is responsible for and to its members, so its scope is limited, seen from a certain perspective, whereas somebody like Strieber has put himself out before the public as the public intellectual of the close encounter phenomenon. He wants to be the foremost interpreter of it. His website, therefore, is, you know, part of his work, and it's always the most up-to-date expression of his work, and the people who are encouraged to go on there, and the form of expressions they're encouraged to make, all of that is of a piece. So you could say that the public harm done by Strieber and his work and his website is far greater than the public harm done by a private group that's dysfunctional. But
Sure.
It's simply a matter of perspective. I mean, one affects you personally, the other affects you maybe in a more abstract way.
Sure.
But at the root of it, it's the same human dysfunction, just the same stupidity.
I agree with you with Strieber and the injuries done to the public mind. I don't think it's insignificant, you know. People look at Strieber with his outlandish claims that he, you know, presents so sincerely, and it's passably authentic, and it just leads to dismissal and derision.
I'm, in a way, I'm long past caring now. It's been more than a year since the paper came out, or maybe just about a year exactly. And it really burned me for many months, everything that went on surrounding it. At this point, enough time has passed, and, you know, I've moved on for other reasons, that it's not as big a concern. But it would cease to be a concern entirely if I just saw one other decisive public rebuff to Strieber based on the same grounds. In other words, in that paper, I unearthed countless instances of what could only be described as confabulation. I cited the sourcing, the likely authentic sourcing behind the confabulations. I also painted a psychological portrait of Strieber that could be inferred from not only the confabulations, but from the overall shape and tenor of his work. It's one that everybody always kind of knew. They always suspected it. But because Strieber presents himself in a very intellectual way and his work is very convoluted and involves all of these references to different traditions and intellectual modes of thought, then he ropes in the quantum theory and the science news, nobody could ever be bothered to wrestle with his work in any real way, not at the level of detail. But if I could just see one other independent source that basically said something truthful about Strieber, and not in an incomplete way. I mean, it doesn't have to be another 300-page paper, but you can probably know what I mean. I mean, just the idea that somebody else separately has basically seen the same thing and has identified it and says, yep, Strieber's full of shit, and he's full of shit in these ways, and it's all pretty obvious, then I would have zero resentment left. It would simply be gone, because then, okay, fine. I'm not alone. I mean, obviously, we've discussed it at length ad nauseum, and that's not exactly what I mean as far as being alone, but I mean just in the public sphere, online, instead of somebody just writing the facts in the strange case of Whitley Strieber, which is a title that keeps getting recycled.
Yeah.
There's a chapter in Conroy's book where he basically says something like the strange case of Whitley Strieber, or the facts in the strange case of Whitley Strieber. Then Keefus and his shoddy little postings there stole that, also stole the title of another chapter in Conroy's book, Will the Real Whitley Strieber Please Stand Up? Then later professed surprise and claimed it was all a coincidence that he had titled his own essays with these titles, and Conroy had used those as chapters of his book. I mean, fuck off. Why would you even have to lie about that? But then, not long ago, a couple months back, somebody on one of these bullshit sites, like a BuzzFeed Lite type site, comes out with another story about Whitley Strieber. It's like the facts in the strange case of Whitley Strieber. Like they even reuse the same fucking titles again and again, and say nothing new. Yes, Whitley Strieber was a New York Times bestselling author, and then he wrote this strange memoir about his contact with aliens, and what a strange career, and what a strange case. And that's it. Nobody's bothered to look at it in any detail, so it would be nice if that were done and it were done independently, because then, I don't know, it just gives that particular form of confidence and satisfaction. Okay, somebody else saw it in the same way and wrote it up, and then, you can be done with it.
Yeah. Well, don't hold your breath.
It's never going to happen. Yeah. And why would it? Why would it? I mean, what? There's not enough interest.
No, and I mean, it's even the thing is too, is that like his work is passing out of the vanishingly small part of the public that's interested in this sort of thing. Like Strieber's books people aren't going to come across them. They're only, you'd have to order them, off Amazon or read them on Kindle, and it's just not going to happen. I mean, what little people know of Strieber is what they pick up of from Dreamland and the like.
Well, another thing that irks me about it, the thing that bothers me about it is just, it's cumulative. Your disappointments in life, they're cumulative, I think. Some of them. Disappointments of a particular sort, I think, are cumulative. And speaking only for myself, the disappointments with other people and figures that you want to elevate into heroes and you want to have great esteem for, the disappointment that comes when you see that the flaws are not only there, but pretty fucking serious, and that they go against the person's stated role in the scheme of things. These disappointments are cumulative. And it's not so much for me that Strieber himself turned out to be full of shit in these extremely deep-seated and convoluted ways, but that it was yet another instance where somebody that you really had high hopes for and, you wanted to be able to rely upon, you couldn't. It was taken away. Because, again, it's not a question of believing everything Strieber said or believing his worldview. I always thought that at least he was basically reliable. There were clearly cases where he was unreliable, and it was obvious, where his memory was fragmentary or strained, but very often he would admit that. But I thought that because he's obviously such a talented writer, and because he has some sort of intellectualism that's completely missing everywhere else in the field, that he was basically reliable. Now that sounds like a preposterous thing to say, especially at this point, that you're going to say Whitley Strieber equals basically reliable. I mean, it's almost unthinkable now to connect those phrases, but no, I mean, I thought, this is, even if it's mistaken in many, many ways, that basically it's reliable. Because if you take a completely stupid person and you put them in a situation of the profundity of alien contact, and they come out muttering nonsense, it's basically unreliable. That's the feeling you get. That their descriptions are not worthy of the phenomenon. They can't be. And Strieber's descriptions, even if they were false in particulars, different particulars, you always thought that they were worthy of the phenomenon. They were probably grasping as well as anybody could the challenge of being true to the phenomenon. So in a field, if you want to call it a field, or a subject matter where there's such an absence of anything else that's even halfway decent, you could at least hold on to Strieber and say, okay, I'm going to keep following what he's writing about and his interpretations of experiences and so on and so forth, because, this is at least a better bet than everything else. Fucking forget about it.
Yeah.
And like everything else, it turns out to be just some sort of awful, almost, it couldn't be designed to be worse. I mean, it's just such a god-awful, convoluted sham. Instead of shenanigans, him and his followers and his wife and all the bullshit that they've produced over the years. So you can't even rely on that. I mean, it's like the guy in a storm, He's like, well, at least I've got my newspaper over my head. It's holding off some of the rain from and then a sharp wind comes and blows the newspaper out of his hands. He's like, now I don't even have the newspaper anymore. That's kind of how it feels.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and if there's something I can, maybe some way I relate to that, what comes to mind as you discuss it is that I just finished reading a book by David Tertium, who was with Mrs. Savali. She was one of those students, and he's just putting together basically how limited some of these leading pupils were, how they just engaged in just basically low-level fraud, and said about just deceiving people and very deceiving and manipulating people, and just, again, very pathetic, small political ways. And you're just like, oh, it's just, you're like, oh, Jesus, not again. You sort of shaking your head. Well, I am, obviously, if there's my involvement there, and you think, what the fuck? And I find out, I keep making myself like a calculation. I think, well, Jesus Christ, I hope I can fundamentally recover from this. That my life doesn't just amount to, well, I got sucked in here, as we say in Australia, sucked in means to be fooled. And I got sucked in for about 7 or 8 years, and then I came out the other side. You just kind of retain that hope that you will be able to, fashion some sound insight that you can, however minor and relatively insignificant it is to the greater world, but something that you can just hold fast to as true and worthwhile, and then have the hope you can actually pass that on in some way.
Yeah, well, I think you do. I think as you genuinely acquire experience in life, and I would liken it to the metaphor of like an image on a computer. As you increase the resolution of the image, you see the objects in the image with more clarity. And as you have these experiences in life, provided you're a person who's actually accumulating these experiences and reapplying them and synthesizing them, not many people are. But as you do, I think inevitably, to a greater or lesser extent, the resolution, the clarity of the objects in the image, they increase. And so you're able to see life with more clarity, and what's available in life, what the opportunities are, what you're actually presented with. And of course, that's a double-edged sword, because at a lower resolution, you might perceive in your life in front of you, you might perceive among all the other things, a basic reliability of people. And then on closer examination, you realize, okay, it's not a basic reliability. People are not basically reliable, but some people are basically reliable. And then you can discover, unfortunately, after a set of events or a sequence of years, that basically people are unreliable, that there are no reliable people. And so maybe you see that now with a greater clarity. Unfortunately, what you're seeing is a negative outcome. I just happened to be looking at the Wikipedia article on P.D. Ouspensky, to bring it back around to what we were talking about at the start.
Yeah,
just to give an example, about unreliability. Here at the start of the article, toward the end of the intro, it says, some, including his close pupil Rodney Collins, say that he finally gave up the system in 1947 just before his death. But his own recorded words on the subject, quote, a record of meetings, which was published posthumously, do not clearly endorse this judgment, nor does Ouspensky's emphasis on, quote, you must make a new beginning, end quote, after confessing, quote, I've left the system.
All right.
So you can interpret that in two ways. Either Ouspensky said, actually you can interpret it in three ways. Either Ouspensky said to, for example, his close pupil Rodney Collins, you, Rodney, must make a new beginning because I've left the system, in which case he was saying something in a personal context that was relevant to their relationship. That's number one. Or he actually said to Rodney Collins and others, as you said, there's no system, so you need to do something new, in which case he was making an absolute blanket statement about the Gurdjieff work and so on. Or in the third case, which is an add-on to the second, this ambiguity is created in the article by Gurdjieffian followers who want to poo-poo the notion that Ouspensky at the end of his life said it was all bullshit. So, people get on here and they edit this stuff all the time. So, they can get on here and say this whole but clause, like after it says some, including Rodney Collins, say that he gave up the system in 1947, just before his death, but his own recorded words on the subject don't clearly endorse this judgment, nor does his emphasis on such and such. But my point is that the ambiguity of it is basically created by people who are being unreliable. They're not being strictly truthful. So you can't tell exactly what the story is. And it's rife. I mean, that's 99.99% of human life is just this collision of unreliabilities.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting as you're talking. I just had a quick look at the, what Lachman writes there. And Lachman reports that this meeting was attended by 300 people, and he says definitively at the close, he said, there is no system. And I've just read the quote. Now, of course, then when I wanted to see where this quote is drawn from, well, it is from a record from the meetings, and I don't have those, so I can't actually tell you exactly what it said. We would suppose that on such a simple point there that Lachman can faithfully and honestly reproduce what was actually said. Do you mean, Mr. Ouspensky, that you have abandoned the system? To this, the teacher simply replied, there is no system.
Well, there's some ambiguity there. I mean, he could be objecting to it being framed in terms of a system, quote unquote.
But the context
yeah.
The context is where he's challenging a lot of just the key ideas about every mention of the teaching, every remark about sleep, mechanicalness, self-remembering, every question couched in the jargon of the system was thrown back at the questioners with the absurd and unbelievable reply that Ouspensky had no teaching, that he never taught them anything, that in any case, why should they believe anyone who told them they were mechanical or asleep? So he just gives instances of where he's just, obviously just rejecting the key tenets of the ideas. But as I said, I don't have that record of the meeting, so I can't really check for myself, but it's...
Yeah. Well, there's ambiguity that is intrinsic, that isn't always put down to the unreliability of people, but a lot of it is. I would just note also that in looking at this, that I knew this a year ago, but I've since forgotten it. It says Ouspensky's first book, The Fourth Dimension, appeared in 1909. So that gives you some idea of what his trajectory was and his primary concerns. His very first book was The Fourth Dimension. Tertium Organum appeared in 1912, his second book, and I think that revisited some of the themes. Then A New Model of the Universe, 1914, which is updated to include recent developments in physics, so on and so forth. So first three books were all centered around this visualization of a fourth dimension, the idea of this higher dimension just above ours, how time could exist, how time was just sort of an illusion that occurs on our level in the same way that, and this is the example Strieber uses, which he stole from, I think it was Ouspensky, but it's detailed in the paper. The idea of a round ball passing through a plane. At the level of the plane, it appears to simply be a circle. But obviously, if you can see from outside the plane, it's a sphere. Now, Ouspensky uses the exact same sort of thought experiment, except I think he uses a cube. Strieber takes it, puts it in the mouth of the master, the key, of course. But anyway, these very specific concerns about the spatial higher dimensionality of creation and how time itself was not simply a modality of change within a three-dimensional space. That was his whole thing. That was his whole shtick, his whole first three books. And it shows up again in Miraculous when here and there, I think in a couple places, Ouspensky tries to question Gurdjieff about it or things related to the ideas. But
in terms of just the history of ideas, and where does Ouspensky rank? I mean, is his effort here to wrestle with, looking at Tertium, Organum, it makes reference here to, in this, the first important work to deal with the new mathematics and the theory of relativity from the standpoint of philosophy, blah, blah, blah. I mean, is this what's the ranking? What's the relative ranking or rating of this work, or Ouspensky? I mean, is he
well, I don't think it... Well, I find it of personal interest myself this way of conceiving of time as a higher dimensional space that is not simply, as I said, the sort of mode of change within space.
Yeah.
And I've incorporated it to some extent in my own thinking about things. I think there's something to it. More objectively speaking, though, as far as how he's considered, I mean, he's not considered a first-rate or even a second-rate philosopher. His work isn't studied in philosophy departments. I think his work is only studied to the extent that he was associated with Gurdjieff.
Yeah.
And from that point of view, or from that approach, his pre-miraculous writings, those three mentioned, end up just being ways to view Ouspensky and his intellectual development before Gurdjieff, at which point he becomes notable.
Yeah.
Which in a way is a bit of a shame. But, I mean, that's as far as I know about it. I never encounter references to Ouspensky in anything related to philosophy or anything like that. It's always as the guy who was second to Gurdjieff and had his own peculiar interests.
Well, yeah. I suppose what he's done here is just it's a work of it's almost akin to creative fiction. It's just a work of fiction. You know, when you're engaged in such speculation. You know.
Well, that's what philosophy is, but it's a question of how well it's done. When your creative speculation rises to the level of an art, and I'm not talking just in literary terms, in the sense that it's well expressed, but in the originality of the concepts, in their interrelationships, and also how well it relates to the rest of the tradition, that's vital. Because for scholars to esteem a philosopher, really they have to be able to have something to write about. And all they have to write about is how that work and how the concepts and the pieces that make up that work relate to other philosophical works and bits and pieces. So how Nietzsche's concept of the will to power relates to Schopenhauer's concept of the will. And, so this is, it's tied to academic production. The esteem given to a given thinker or philosopher, of course, is to some large extent a function of how much he gives people to write about, whether it's dissertations or academic journal articles and so on. But
Well, just thinking about something you said earlier, you said, you'd have had repeated disillusionment with people you would have as your heroes, but you seem, you've repeatedly spoken highly of Lacan, and it seems that the ambition in his sort of thinking and analysis has, made an impression on you and certainly affected your own thinking and your own perceptions and your discussion. I mean, I was quite, I even said it to you the other night, I was quite impressed by just a couple of insights you had just as I was talking. You spoke to how I'd framed certain experiences. And I was wondering with Lacan and his contributions to psychotherapy and psychology, I mean, is that something that you remained in respect of or appreciative of, or is something you continue to salute, or did you in any way become disillusioned with that?
Well, it's a hard question to answer. I have very complicated feelings about Lacanian psychoanalysis. None of it is to my taste. If I had to name a thinker who was most formative on me and who I would regard as my favorite, let's say, not simply in terms of taste, but also obviously in terms of quality of content, because if you allow the two to become disconnected, then you're just a dilettante, you know, you just choose anybody. But no, the name hands down would be Nietzsche. I think anybody can be rewarded by reading Nietzsche. The voice is so strong, and the amount of energy in his thinking is so strong. And it also turns out that so much of what he writes about is true. In other words, you could perhaps find a thinker or philosopher who the same things can be said about, but then disagree with every particular, in which case you don't find it particularly nourishing. But no, I mean, for me, Nietzsche is the quintessential thinker. Now, that doesn't mean I haven't departed intellectually from him, or even my own opinion advanced on him in certain areas. Just the other day, I was trying to go back and take a look at some of the writings from his late notebooks. And I was struck by how quaint it all appears now. Because everybody, even the greatest thinker, is writing for a particular time and place, for a particular imagined audience. And even if he, as was expressly the case with Nietzsche, even if he is writing for an audience of the future, that particular vision of the future is ultimately a reflection of his present, who he was at that time and place. So that belongs to a similar category. It belongs in a broadly to the same category of disillusionment that I was referring to earlier when talking about somebody like Strieber or whoever else. So anyway, if you ask me who I would hold up, who I would recommend as a thinker, as someone to read, as a genuine mind, I would say Nietzsche. When it comes to Lacan, they can't be more opposite in terms of what they offer and the type of taste required. I mean, it's almost beyond them being mutually unintelligible. It's almost as if they belong to two totally different universes. It's completely alien. I can only say that having had in the past some success with thinking myself, back when I had a functioning mind, and therefore being able to recognize it in others, I could always see that there was something real going on in Lacan. Even though in the beginning, when I first encountered it many years ago, it was totally far removed from anything I was interested in. I mean, I'd always been interested in psychology. Why do people think what they do? What are the real causes, you know? And in broadly thematic terms, I was always interested in psychoanalysis. The idea of an unconscious mind seemed obvious. But when you get to Lacan, it's just such a strange, bizarre world of concepts, and the practice and everything is just so alien and strange. But it was undeniable that here was a virtuoso thinker. That was the conclusion I came to after reaching a certain level of familiarity with it. And that, in fact, because of what the work represents, there was more to it than you could ever possibly get simply by reading it. One of the fundamental tenets, if you can call it that, of Lacanian psychoanalysis is that the mind thinking by itself is only ever repeating its own illusions in a sense. And this is why psychoanalysis, according to Lacan, is opposed to philosophy. Philosophy is just the ego re-encountering itself. Whereas for Lacan, behind the ego is a subjectivity which is decentered. There's no center. It's always out of joint. And the only way that you can touch that reality, the reality of the subjectivity, that is, in a way, the more basic reality, is in an analysis. Because when you are talking to someone else in an analytic environment, you are decentered. You are not simply thinking what you want to think to yourself, you're speaking. And of course, in the classic Freudian way, you say things you don't mean to say. And you say more than you mean to say. And you struggle with what you're trying to say precisely what you want to say, but you can't say it, and it goes on and on and on. So this experience of being decentered, the ego being decentered, that is something that cannot be achieved or even correctly conceptualized without being in an analysis where you actually experience it, you know?
Yeah.
In a sense, you could make the basic appeal to experience and say, just like someone like a woman who's never given birth, she'll never know what it is till she's done it. And then all these other cases where the experience is irreducible. In Lacanian psychoanalysis, according to the theory, and this is what they endeavor to bring about in practice, they endeavor to bring about a certain decentering that is inevitable because, according to them, by definition, the subject, your subjectivity, is already decentered. It's already a sort of, it's a paradoxical phenomenon that's both inside you and outside you at the same time. This is sort of where the unconscious is located. So anyway, I have grappled with and have come to understand in large measure, certainly not completely, but in large measure, this very esoteric doctrine, which is very intellectually sophisticated. And so I have respect for it, certainly to that extent. And again, I think Lacan was one of the two great virtuoso thinkers of the 20th century. The other being another French philosopher, Derrida, who was associated with something called deconstruction. And of course, they were bitterly opposed to each other. But in terms of the talent of their thinking, the ability to think, I think those two are at the top. But I have a very uneasy relationship to Lacanian psychoanalysis because, you know, it's just, what does it give you? I mean, it's very hard for me to explain.
Sure. But I think you said before he found that it was the most effective avenue of treatment.
Well, as a form of treatment, you know, in the psychotherapeutic sense of like the talking cure, nothing else comes close in its rigor, in the rigor of its formulation and in the quality of its theoretical basis. Nothing else comes close. All the other forms of psychoanalysis are just a bunch of metaphors that they pretend to base a practice on. Lacanian psychoanalysis is excruciatingly intricate and complex. But you know, the thing about it, in trying to answer the earlier question better, is that I would say Lacanian psychoanalysis gives a number of infinitely unsatisfying answers that appear to be correct. So all of these questions about, you know, you name it. I'm talking, it's hard precisely to, Why do people want what they want? And what forms do these desires take? And what's the nature of the cause of desire? How does the cause relate to the effect? And what are the causes for all these psychopathologies and, these mysteries that everybody experiences in themselves? Why they want this, why they don't want that, why they want this one day and the next day they don't. All of these questions that are not necessarily philosophical, in the sense of a philosophical tradition, but definitely present in everyday life, in their immediacy, and no less mysterious for being so. Lacanian psychoanalysis, better than anything else in the world, provides answers, but they are infinitely unsatisfying. They're just terrible. Basically, they're terrible answers that appear to be correct, however you test them. And I've, in my mind, tested different aspects again and again. It appears to be correct. I don't think it's the ultimate truth. I don't think it's an absolutely complete theory, because there are areas where there are questions that are unaddressed. But in those areas where there are questions that are addressed, nothing else comes close, and yet the answers are appalling.
Appalling in that it has a depressive effect on your own hopes for yourself and for others.
Well, I mean, why do people have hope, and what is the nature of hope, and what's really behind hope, and what's the meaning of aspiration?
Well, in the minimal sense, you hope to have relief from your immediate condition.
Yeah, but what does that mean, relief?
You no longer feel the way you feel. You no longer experience that which brought you to study of Lacan or seeking out a Lacanian treatment in the first instance. What I'm trying to just is understand what you mean by it being terrible. That that the answers seem to be incontrovertible, that there's a strength and robustness to them, but there seems to be an associated effect, or there is an associated effect you describe as it's terrible. And I'm trying to just understand what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I can try to answer it in rather poorly organized terms borrowed from the theory. Let's suppose that there is something called desire, and that desire always has an object. Desire is always desire for something. But then let's suppose that that object of desire is an impossible object in almost a formal mathematical sense, and that the object of desire is also, in a sort of paradoxical way, an impossible way, the cause of the desire. If the object of desire is by definition unattainable, that is one example of a terrible answer, an appalling answer to something that is absolutely germane to human life, and yet the answer appears to be true. If, for example, everything that you want in life, and even, the self-image you construct for yourself, if all of these things are just metaphors for a sort of original lost object, and that lost object not only cannot be attained, but is nothing more than an accidental driving feature of your entire life and everything that you are. The idea that you might yourself simply be that set of accidents with no higher purpose or no higher meaning, that is another example of a horrible, appalling answer that's probably correct.
I'm sure you see the parallels here with Gurdjieff.
Yeah, and I've tried to point them out in the past. I mean, there is a sort of practical, psychological thing going on in Gurdjieff at work in his doctrine, especially the earlier stuff. And it suggests an interest in something that might be called the unconscious, and it suggests the automatic nature of our desires, the unthinking nature of our desires, and so on. But you see, even Gurdjieff holds out the promise of mastery.
Yeah.
Gurdjieff holds out the promise of a goal, liberation of some kind, some positive telos, like a teleological movement from the present dissatisfaction or suffering or lack of mastery to the future happiness, mastery, overcoming, and so on. But you don't have that in psychoanalysis. You have simply the repetition of the struggle until you become aware that you are that struggle and you more or less just identify with the struggle. So the cause, the object cause of desire loses something of its original fixation. Doesn't mean you stop desiring, but now you have a different orientation to your own desire in a certain way. But you've not reached the promised land. That's why, for example, in Lacanian psychoanalysis, they don't talk about a cure. They don't talk about adjusting somebody to reality. They don't talk about any of the things you hear in normal psychiatry or psychiatric medicine. Somebody has a problem or a disease and we're going to cure it. They don't talk about that at all. In fact, they very often say that the cure is worse than the disease. Because, you know, you come in there and you're all caught up in your whatever, and at the end of it, you're no longer caught up, but where are you? You've gained something in knowledge, but there you are. Yeah, you're at the end of a process where you are precisely nowhere in a certain sense, but you are aware that you have traversed that fantasy in the broadest sense.
But it seems that in that there's just a demand on human maturity that's not typically made. You could almost say that in, say, what Gurdjieff is saying is holding out the idea of mastery, is that it is an appeal to a very childish desire for things to be simple and easily resolvable, which in everyday life, in more obvious matters, we see it for what it is. It's a childish and ill-fitting response. And it could be that, you know, with so much else in our lives, both individually and collectively, is that our philosophical response to the world has to mature. You know, that it can reach a point where you will accept some sort of baseline dissatisfaction and incompleteness in your thinking and feeling. That is the process of at least reflecting with some fidelity on what is actually occurring.
A choice they can make the choice for that type of maturity. I think it's an unresolved question whether we are simply and nothing more than the accidents that make up who we are. I think the evidence, such as it is, comes down on the likelihood that we are. You know, when you go through a Lacanian psychoanalysis for a sufficient duration, all of your aspirations become problematized. Everything becomes problematized. And to come to grips with that does involve and require the type of maturity that you allude to. because it does appear to be true at the end of that process, or certainly at some sufficient point while it's underway, that you are really simply these accidents. But I cannot be totally sold on it. I can't be sold on it because even though within one perspective it appears to be true, there are still these other questions that are the more bizarre ones that we've discussed in the past. You know, extraterrestrials, ghosts, paranormal phenomena, God, spirituality, these other things that are outliers, synchronicities. On the one hand, the physical world appears to be dominated by chance. And the physical world, where you draw the boundary between the physical world and the human world, the more you look at it, the more that it gets shifted further and further into the physical world. So, you know, like if I go out into the corridor and I hit the button for the elevator, the chance that somebody's already in the elevator going to a different floor, that is an event that is dominated by chance. But at the same time, here's a human being with his or her own intentionality in the middle of his or her own life, taking the elevator or not for his or her own reasons. So within the human mind, at the level of human experience, in a way, chance doesn't exist. But on the other hand, chance appears to be the only thing that exists. And when you go through a psychoanalysis and you repeat all these fantasies and aspirations, and you know, it all amounts to sort of nothing, you just become confronted with the accidental circumstances and causes that seem to be responsible for you having these desires. And when your innermost thoughts and your innermost feelings, which you've kept from the world, for example, which you've most strongly identified with, when they in the end appear simply to be accident, and when it appears that it could have gone the other way and you could have had different thoughts and feelings or different innermost convictions, and simply because of the accidental nature of their origin, you know, that's a worldview and an experience that is in a sense profoundly disempowering, but on the other hand, it seems to be truthful and comes down on the side of, again, to use your term, maturity. But is it the final ultimate truth? I don't know. Synchronicities, for example, seem specifically aligned against chance, and that, in fact, a synchronicity is almost something which is anti-chance by definition. If, you know, Dean Radin's consciousness experiments can be believed, and people can affect random number generators to some extent with the application of their minds. Here again, we're talking about something which is expressly about chance. So you have consciousness on one side, chance or accident on the other. If there is a God, if there are higher powers, if there are beings with telepathy, and who knows, the whole thing, all of these other doorways of leading into questions that are still unanswered, then as magnificent as this theory is, at the same time that it's profoundly distasteful, that as magnificent a theoretical construction that this Lacanian psychoanalysis is, it may not be the whole story, and it may be missing something fundamental, which is part of the reason why I have such uneasy feelings about it.